Hey Matrix, welcome to your next section of work. Plant reproduction is almost finished, so this is the third section. So we're going to be dealing with how plants are adapted for certain types of pollination. So we're going to deal with insect pollinators, bird pollinated, and wind pollinated. And then after the section, I'll just fill in a couple of gaps with some other leftover sections, nothing too crazy, and then we're pretty much finished plant reproduction. So the sections are going very fast, so I hope you guys are keeping up. And remember, if you guys have got any questions at all, just let me know and we can chat about it. All right, so let's begin. First of all, I know that I expected you guys to hopefully know what this diagram is. So this is the general diagram of any sort of flower. And you need to know this. It's extremely important, and it's expected of you to actually be able to draw this in your final exam. So what I recommend you do is you draw this 10 or 12 times, and then each time, like maybe leave a chunk out, maybe leave the male part out or the female part, and just keep on building up as you're going along. So I'm just going to go over some of the main important bits, and if you are getting a bit lost in any of this, you're more than welcome to go on to page 60, and I do recommend you actually go there. So when you draw it, you can summarize all the bits and pieces around it, so that all the explanations. So let's start with the male side of things, just because they're easier. So the male part is known as the filament and the anther, and together the filament and anther makes the stamen. So the filament is just the structure that comes off of the little bit at the bottom there called the receptacle, and it allows the anther to be held up and out so that it has access to either wind blowing past it or insects and or birds who put their face inside to drink some nectar. Okay, so the anther is where the pollen is going to be produced from. So inside over there, you're going to be finding a lot of meiosis, and that meiosis is going to be allowing for the production of male gametes, which is ultimately going to allow which needs to be moved for pollination to occur, and eventually fertilization on the female part called the stigma, okay, or the sticky stigma. Just around the back part of it, we have the petals, and then on the left-hand side, we have the female reproductive component. So that is the stigma, style, and ovary. Another name for that, oh, there's not another name for the ovary. I'm just saying inside of the ovary is the ovule. So that is that structure that is inside of the ovary, and the ovule produces the ova. Okay, so the ovary has ovules, and the ovule produces ovums. Okay, or ova. The style holds up the entire structure called the stigma, and the stigma is sometimes feathery, depending on how it is dispersed, as well as it generally has like a sticky kind of nectar substance to it, and that allows for any pollen going past or brought to it to stick so that it can grow. Now, what I want you to also have a look at is that that stigma kind of is in four chunks over there. So the stigma can be broken up into threes, fives, tens, nothing more than like 15. And it's actually like it's like a pie, and it's been cut. And each one of those segments is going to produce maybe a specific seed and or part of the fruit. All right, so that's how segments work when we talk about like nachis and that kind of vibe. All right, so now the stigma is sticky, and that allows for where the pollen adheres to. The style is the section joining the stigma to the ovary, and then we spoke about the ovules and ovary as well. All right, they used to call it the pistil. Okay, so the style, stigma, and ovary used to be called the stigma, pistil. So it can still be called the pistil, but if you learn it as the carpel, that would probably be slightly more useful. Okay, so throw the old word out, pistil, and now put in the word carpel. Okay, and that is the female reproductive part. Now the male and female reproductive part are both joined at the base of the receptacle, and the receptacle is attached to the peduncle. And then on the outside of the receptacle, you'll find sepals. Some people call them sepals. It's completely up to you how you feel like pronouncing it. That sepal itself provides a lot of protection for the reproductive organs while the flower is developing. So often if you've had a rose that hasn't gone into bloom just yet, it's got that green covering over it. Many flowers have this, and when that eventually pops open, that's when you actually have all these different structures popping out. So the sepal or sepal itself is a type of modified leaves, and this is going to help with the entire idea of just like keeping everything safe. In your textbooks, you'll notice there's a word, and it's going to talk about the perianth, which is the calyx and the corolla. Now, like the corolla itself is only on very specific plants, okay, or very specific flowers. So, for instance, what do you call that thing? A rose doesn't necessarily have a corolla. But if you want to, I'll take some pictures of flowers outside of my house over here, and they have a special corolla. And this is where pollinators can actually land. So it's a specialized other sort of like wool or like ring of reproductive organs that allows for the entire structure to be put together. And then they say that the sepals plus the corolla make the perianth. Okay, so don't get too confused about that, but rather just learn the ones on the slide here. So let's look at how insect pollinated flowers respond and how they act and what they do. So petals are large and bright to attract insects. Okay, they have to be large and bright so that the insect can actually see it, even though they have quite acute or very specialized eyesight. You'll notice that it really is difficult for them to find it. So and also certain pollinators are attracted to specific colors. So for instance, bees are attracted to warm colors, so like yellows and oranges and reds, and whereas sort of moths are attracted to slightly darker colors. But also note that moths are attracted at night. So any flower that you notice is very brightly colored is generally going to be pollinated by either wasps or bees, and sometimes even mosquitoes. Whereas flowers who don't really have bright colors, they're often pollinated by moths, and they go through a whole completely different attraction as well. So scent or nectar attracts animals and provides food. Remember that it's a very time or like energy expensive process to transport pollen from one plant to the other. So a plant often gives some sort of what do you call it? Like gift to the pollinator to attract it to come back. And especially bees. Bees really appreciate plants that have a very sweet taste to them, and that's because they have nectar. Right, the anthers and stigma are inside of the flowers where the insect has to brush past them. So a lot of the time you get at the base of the petals, you'll find a little nectar, I don't know, like factory, if you will, and that nectar, which is right at the base over there, forces the insect to come all the way into the base of the flower so that it can actually get hold of that nectar, and through that process it then drops off the pollen it's been moving across. Pollen grains are also sticky or spiky, allowing them to attach to insects. And when we get back, I'd like to bring some flowers in so I can actually show you some of the stuff. Then we have the bird pollinated flowers. So these are generally bigger and sturdier flowers. What you're also noting in the one in the picture over there is that it has a trumpet shape. And that is because the mouth part of the bird actually has to get into the base part so its tongue can lick the base of the flower to get the nectar out. And I've actually put in there long and trumpeted shape, so it has no scent, and usually red, orange, or yellow, just because they're nice bright colors and they're warm during the day and they're easy to spot amongst the green colors. And all of these flowers produce nectar. They have to. Birds are so large that they require so much energy to be able to go through the process of this pollination or help plants being pollinated that it requires them to they have to offer up some sort of nectar from the nectar factory at the base of the plant itself or the flower. Then we have wind pollinated flowers. These bad boys are completely weird, and you won't even recognize that you know these things. So they do not have a scent, they have no nectar, and they have no bright flowers. To a large extent, they don't even have petals. So they're extremely weird, and that's because they don't rely on any sort of living pollinator, but instead they rely on wind. So they produce large amounts of pollen, which is light and floats in the wind. So does it sound very much like gymnosperms from last year with wind dispersed pollen and seeds? Oh yes. Okay. The anthers are large and hang outside of the flower. So when the pollen is produced out of the anther, so meiosis has occurred in the anther and the pollen is pushed out, the wind can actually pick it up and blow it across, and hopefully it will find another flower to pollinate. But now through this process, you can remember that I mentioned that pollen lands on a stigma. So now, if like you want this to land on a stigma, it means you need to grow your stigma a lot bigger as well. So the stigmas are large and feathery and allow them to easily trap pollen grain. So it's almost like they hang like ropes, and these like they create these nets, and all the pollen that goes past can actually be attached to that stigma, and then pollination will occur. All right, so those are the different ways that adaptation of plants have allowed for pollination. Let's go into the next section called the significance of seeds, and specifically seed banks. So you guys understand that seeds are very important to continue the DNA as well as the the progeny of like the parent plant. So the South African National Biodiversity Institute, or SANBI, and the Royal Botanical Gardens in England, called the London Kew Gardens, are working together to conserve our seeds as part of the Millennium Seed Bank project. All right, now this is so important, and don't just think like humans are actively, we are the only ones who are making these little seed banks. To a large extent, plants create seed banks as well. Some of their seeds actually land in the soil, and then they don't germinate, creating this beautiful little seed bank idea, and they just sit underground, and they wait for the perfect environment so that they can grow up afterwards. So seeds of more than 25,000 plant species have been collected and preserved. These are as many plants as they can possibly do, even ones that aren't necessarily at risk of extinction, but many of them are endangered, threatened, or very rare species species endemic to South Africa. Please remember the word endemic means it's only found in one particular spot. So to a large extent, we have two biodiversity hotspots. So that is the Fynbos all the way in Cape Town, and then we have the Namakuru and that entire like bit on the far western coast of South Africa. Those two biodiversity hotspots, those seeds have been collected in case something goes wrong and a species becomes extinct. They have access to these seeds. Now, as a result of human activity, up to a quarter of all plant species are under the threat of extinction. And this is approximately 80,000 species, and that was quite a while ago, so I'm sure that number's gone up quite significantly. So seed banks conserve seeds of wild plants and crops in effort to conserve biodiversity. Let's just remind you what biodiversity stands for. Bio meaning living, and diversity meaning range of different things. So like the range of different living organisms in the world. And like seeds are simple. Human beings are starting to create a conservation of eggs and sperm of animals. So for instance, they're going for the rhinos at the moment, and they actually have some sperm saved, and they're thinking of trying to reintroduce some of the rhinos, if you want to go read up about that. So over 1,000 seed banks throughout the world, and the Swedish seed bank is the most famous. Seeds are stored at, and this is important, minus 18 degrees Celsius, and will remain viable for thousands of years. So first of all, you need to drop the temperature, and you can't just throw them in the freezer because they'll get frostbite. So you first need to treat these seeds with large amounts of sugar, and then because you've always noticed like you can't freeze syrup, so they increase the amount of sugar in all of these seeds, and then they slowly but surely drop the temperature, and they actually create this like environment for the seed where it becomes dormant. And when it becomes dormant, it means it uses such a little bit of its stored up nutrients that it can survive for thousands of years. And the word viable means that if I took that seed out and I defrosted it the correct manner, it would be able to grow into its original parent plant. But there's a couple of problems around all of this, and I'm sure you guys can think of a couple. Like, let's say we have seeds that were stored from 100 years ago. What plants look like nowadays because of the adaptations is completely different. So when we were talking about sexual reproduction earlier, I mentioned that there is genetic variation. But what if those seeds that they have, allowed to now germinate after they've been stored for like tons of years, now all of a sudden cannot survive in that very particular environment because our environment is changing so quickly. So seeds are a very important source of food, and this is really why we also want to save a lot of seeds. So there's a lot of crops that we don't want to run the risk of disappearing or becoming extinct. So stores food for seeding store food for feeding plants until it can support itself. Plant seeds are most important planting seeds are the most important source of human food, and these are two main important ones, and they are grains and pulses. So grains are seeds with high starch content like maize, wheat, and rice, which is a very much staple in a lot of South Africa and the rest of the world's diets, except for what do you call it? The whole of the UK. I mean, they survive on potatoes. And then we have the pulses, which are seeds of leguminous. So legumes are your peas, beans, lentils, and they're extremely high in protein content. Okay, so in South Africa we like our beans, so like that would go part of as well, like your black-eyed peas, your kidney beans. I think it's called the red spotted bean as well. All of those are extremely high in protein. So with high starch content and high protein content, you can have a very decent diet. And also remember that seeds are a rich source of oil, and we know this from sunflower oil, canola oil, peanut oil, sesame seed oil, for goodness sake, like any seed you can think of, we can pretty much create an oil from it. Okay, so this is the importance of why we need to store these seeds and how we store these seeds in these seed banks. Please note that they are artificial seed banks and they are natural seed banks. And yeah, that's about it. So next time I'll be finishing off a couple of other bits and pieces, and then we will probably have to start human reproduction. Woo!